320 Days of Post-Stroke Neurological Reorganization Part 1, number 1629, the 6th of May 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation, category, Stroke and Seizures. Special note, this research journal is based on my personal research using data from my own body and is provided for educational purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice and should not be interpreted as guidance from medical professionals. Preface, today is May 6, 2026, 319 days after my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025. During the past 10 months, I have written several research articles discussing my stroke recovery, neuroplasticity, cognitive changes, emotional changes, and my observations regarding how the human brain reorganizes itself after major neurological injury. However, after recently returning to Honolulu, Hawaii, I realized it is time to revisit this subject again more carefully because I have now discovered additional layers of neurological recovery that I did not fully recognize several months earlier. Early memory recovery. At the beginning of my recovery, especially during the first 3 months after the stroke, my greatest concern was memory loss. Since my entire professional life had depended heavily on memory, pattern recognition, systems thinking, mathematical abstraction, and rapid conceptual association, the possibility of cognitive decline frightened me deeply. I knew that if I lost those abilities significantly, then not only my medical research, but also my entire identity as an engineer, ad developer, system thinker, and businessman will fundamentally change. Therefore, I immediately began conducting my own practical memory rehabilitation exercises. One of the simplest methods I used was opening the refrigerator and carefully observing approximately 10 food items. I would then close the refrigerator door and, 10 to 15 minutes later, attempt to recall how many items I could still remember correctly. At that early stage, I could remember only about 60% of the items. In my own simple estimation, I interpreted this as approximately 40% short-term memory loss. At that time, I was extremely worried. I did not know whether the damage would continue worsening, stabilize, or recover, since I am not a neuroscientist or neurologist. I had no precise understanding of which neural systems had been damaged. However, from my systems engineering background, I knew that complex systems often recover through adaptation and rerouting rather than through simple restoration of the original pathway. Therefore, I continued these exercises every day while simultaneously maintaining intensive mental activity through writing, medical research, mathematical modeling, data analysis, and continuous self-observation. Several months later, before my February 2026 trip to Hawaii, I believed my recovery had become almost complete. Using these simple memory tests, he estimated that my memory recovery had reached approximately 98% to 99%. Only 1 or 2% appeared missing. Naturally, this gave me considerable relief and confidence. Discovery of intermediate-term memory loss. However, after arriving in Honolulu and revisiting many locations that I had previously visited several years earlier, I discovered something important that completely changed my understanding of my own recovery. My earlier memory tests were far too simple and measured only one narrow dimension of memory function. Real-world memory is far more complicated than remembering 10 food items inside a refrigerator. As I walked through neighborhoods, rode buses, revisited familiar streets, and returned to stores I had visited years earlier, I noticed that certain memories were still partially missing. In particular, I sometimes could not remember street names, store locations, neighborhood orientation, acquaintances I met several years ago, or the contextual stories associated with those people. Most interestingly, the pattern was not random. Very old memories from 20, 30, or even 40 years ago remained remarkably clear. Recent memories from the past several months also remained relatively well intact. However, memories from approximately 1 to 3 years before the stroke appeared partially weakened. At first, this puzzled me greatly. I tried to understand why this particular time window seemed more vulnerable than either very old memories or very recent ones. Then another important observation gradually emerged. As I physically revisited locations and received contextual reminders from my wife regarding past events, many of these memories slowly returned. Suddenly, I could remember the names of certain people, conversations we had, locations we visited together, or events that occurred several years earlier. This observation became extremely important to me because it changed my interpretation of what had happened inside my brain. Semiconductor routing analogy. Using my semiconductor chip design experience during 1981 to 2002, I began thinking about memory recovery using a placement hand routing analogy. During my engineering years, especially in AI-assisted semiconductor physical design, we often dealt with transistor placement and electrical routing optimization problems. In many cases, the transistor itself remained completely functional, but if the electrical routing pathway became disconnected or inaccessible, then the stored information could no longer be effectively retrieved. The storage element itself was not necessarily destroyed. The problem instead involved connectivity and accessibility. This analogy closely matches how my present neurological condition feels. I do not believe most of those memories were erased. Instead, it feels as if some neural pathways or retrieval connections became partially disrupted after the stroke, or more precisely, more likely related to my multiple post-stroke seizures. Then, through repeated contextual exposure such as walking through old neighborhoods, revisiting familiar environments, hearing old stories, or seeing visual landmarks again, some of these pathways gradually reconnect, allowing the memories to re-emerge. From a modern neuroscience viewpoint, this resembles neuroplasticity and network rerouting much more than complete memory destruction. Again, I am not a neurologist, but this interpretation appears internally consistent with what I have personally experienced during the past 10 months. Unexpected cognitive enhancement. Another phenomenon occurred simultaneously, and this is perhaps the most fascinating part of my recovery. While some autobiographical and spatial memory weakened, my higher-level conceptual integration and cognitive capability appeared to become significantly stronger. In plain words, I felt like I had become smarter. This sounds paradoxical, but it is exactly what I experienced beginning about 3 months after my stroke event. During the past several months, I suddenly reconnected with mathematical concepts and engineering subjects that I had studied decades ago but had not actively applied for many years. 2 examples are topology and stochastic systems. I first studied these subjects approximately 5 to 6 decades ago, but throughout most of my engineering and business career, I rarely used them directly, either in my career or during my most recent biomedical research period. After the stroke, however, these concepts unexpectedly resurfaced in my mind. Once I spent approximately a week refreshing my memory through online searches and reading some academic books, the concepts rapidly returned, but in a much deeper form than before. This was not simple recollection. It felt more like structural understanding suddenly becoming highly connected and highly accessible. I began seeing clearly that topology could describe geometry, continuity, connectivity, and directional movement across multidimensional biomedical systems. However, topology alone could not fully describe instantaneous state magnitude or accumulated physiological stress. Therefore, I naturally integrated topology, which I first learned in 1967, with my viscoplastic and viscoelastic modeling framework developed since my mid-years in the early 1970s. In my present understanding, topology describes where and how a system moves, while viscoplasticity describes how much strain, stress, energy, or state magnitude exists during movement at a given time instant. By combining these 2 frameworks together, I could finally visualize both system trajectory and system intensity simultaneously in a multidimensional space. This integration unexpectedly accelerated my medical research capability dramatically. During the past year, I have produced more than 100 papers involving topology-related thinking integrated with my viscoplasticity energy framework. More importantly, the connectivity among different disciplines became much faster and more intuitive than before. The transitions between mathematics, physics, AI, semiconductor systems, topology, biomedical systems, and neuroplasticity now occur almost automatically inside my mind. Paradoxically, although part of my intermediate autobiographical memory weakened, my deep abstraction capability became stronger. Therefore, from a systems viewpoint, my stroke did not create uniform global cognitive decline. Instead, it appears to have triggered selective neurological reorganization. Some networks weakened while other networks strengthened. This observation also explains why weakly reinforced memories, casual acquaintances, or low-frequency social interactions became more difficult to retrieve, while lifelong reinforced mathematica structures and conceptual systems became more accessible and more interconnected than before. The brain appears to prioritize and reorganize according to long-term reinforcement intensity and Survival relevance rather than preserving all information equally. This is part 1.